And what we're going to be talking about is the expansion of the Ummah from a very local, relatively small, relatively humble community in the Western Hijaz, the periphery of empires, into the core, the axis of a new, vast, unprecedentedly large empire. Take a look at the map. Take a look at how it absolutely dwarfs the two imperial giants that came before it, the Roman and Iranian empires. No other empire up to this point was even close to being this large, this expansive, this capacious, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in the Western Mediterranean through North Africa, into the Levant, over the Mesopotamian dunes and onto the Iranian plateau, and even further on to the borders of China. This is very impressive. And for a lot of contemporaries, especially those who are involved in the conquest, it kind of provides evidence in their mind that this is the true faith. We are not a wayward people. The prophet was not a false prophet, but in fact, he was the Khatamul Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets. He was a true man, and he was also the beginning of an Islamic faith. And this is also the genesis, roughly, of when the Muslims start to think of themselves slowly but surely as perhaps being distinct from Jews, from Christians, and these Abrahamic predecessors. So what are the nature of these conquests? And perhaps we should pay attention to the etymology. Is conquest the right word? What is the term that they themselves used in this context? And that term is the Arabic fath. Fath means to open. These conquests, in our kind of parlance, in their parlance, futuh, the plural of fath, represented the openings of these non-Muslim communities, people outside of the Ummah, to Islam. I think it is instructive, really, to think about the last major expedition, let's call it, by Muhammad, where he marches from Medina to Mecca. And he opens Mecca to Islam. And we think the last verse and the last chapter of the Quran is celebrating and commemorating this fact. The last chapter is a relatively brief chapter. It says, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَاتِ, and when the support of God comes through, and fat, the opening comes. The opening here referring to Mecca. But what kind of an opening, what kind of a fath is it? The next verse tells us, وَرَأَيْتُ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا, and you shall see the people in their congeries and their throngs enter the religion of God. So the religion of God here is what is being opened to the people. It is a conversion. But this is not what is going on in these futuh. They are certainly opening up these communities, these lands, these kingdoms to the armies of Islam. But do you see رَأَيْتُ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا? The people in their throngs entering into the religion of Muhammad? Certainly not. Do you see the Muslim conquerors attempting to enter them into the religion of God? No, you don't. You see an not so elaborate, very simple system of tribute being set up. And that system of tribute is based on the fact that these conquerors, they are largely from semi-Bedouin, semi-literate, if perhaps we could even think of them as literate at all. People who are not administrators or tax officials, they are not going to be sitting down and going through tax assessments and various ledgers. They can, however, conquer. and they can demand that the people who can, these communities in Iran and the former Roman Empire, who have a very long tradition of belonging to a society unlike the Arab Bedouins. These are sedentary peoples who subsist. What is their socio-economic model? It's agriculture. It is an agrarian economy. It's not a raiding Bedouin economy. And they subsist on regular taxation from not just city centers, but of course, all of those agricultural lands that surround and support those urban centers. And a sort of understanding is formed that we will establish ourselves in strategic bastions, and in exchange for us providing protection, you will provide us with an annual tribute. We don't have the expertise to kind of pry into your bookkeeping. We don't have the people who can act as tax administrators, but we do have the sword, and you have the knowledge on how to administer. So let's come to an understanding, and let's say we will set up in Cairo. Cairo is one of these bastion cities that is established in this period. Cairo is, of course, Qahira. Qahira means vanquisher. Basra in southern Iraq is also one such city. You see these nodes, strategic nodes, being set up for these garrisons of Arab Bedouin armies that are meant to ensure the local population keep to their end of the bargain. They keep sending annual tribute down to the Caliphal treasury. And you can see a lot of red arrows in pretty much all directions. These conquests happen in a matter of just mere decades. It is one of the most rapid and impressive conquests in the history of our species, perhaps with the singular exception of the Mongol conquests, which are even more widespread, more expansive and capacious, and even more lightning in terms of speed and rapidity than the Muslim conquests. Interestingly, also from a nomadic community from the steppe on the other side of the Eurasian plate. But we'll come to the Mongols in a few weeks. As I pointed to last week, just because they're expanding and just because they are vanquishing pretty much any army that stands before them does not really mean that the Arabs in this period are united. It does not really mean that they have no internal squabbles. In fact, the opposite. What happens to 3/4 of the caliphs after Mohammed? They are assassinated. And hardly any of them managed to reign without challenge. I think especially the fourth caliph, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, finds that it is very difficult for him to really even engage in external expansion because he is so concentrated on quelling rebellions and quelling various governors' challenges to his rule and his caliphal authority. Eventually, this spells the end of the Rashidun Caliphate. And very quickly, Islam becomes an imperial, dynastic kind of entity. There's a very charismatic and successful and sly general who becomes the governor of Syria. And in Damascus, he starts to plot against the Caliph Ali. And eventually, he is successful in undermining him. And after Ali is assassinated, we think perhaps through the conspiracy plotted by Muawiyah, Muawiyah marches on to the rest of the cities in this Islamic empire and creates a dynastic entity called the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad Caliphate is therefore fundamentally different from what came before. But in one key characteristic term, it is very similar to what you find in the Roman and Iranian worlds. Why? Because it's a dynastic. father to son kind of imperial mantle that is being handed from one generation to the next. This does not happen smoothly. There are so many rebellions against the Umayyads, just as there had been rebellions against the Abbasids. The Rashidun caliphs. And the son of Ali, the last of the four caliphs, and who is the grandson of the Prophet, launches a rebellion against the Umayyads. And he marches from Arabia north towards Basra and Kufa, and he wants to take on the Umayyads in Baghdad and Syria. Unfortunately for him, with only a small group of followers, perhaps around 70 people, he is checked in southern Iraq around the city of Karbala. And there he is given the option of surrendering, and it is only rational that he would surrender. After all, he is surrounded and besieged by an army of thousands. He only has 70 odd men to support him. The only rational course would be to indeed surrender. But when he is offered to surrender by the Umayyads and be taken to the Caliph, he says no. He says, Hayhat minna dhilla, I will not give in to humiliation. He means, I will give in to death. He means, this struggle over the caliphate is a life and death struggle. And he's not going to submit. He is here to command. And he fights to the death. This is one of the most powerful episodes in early Islamic history. Shias, because Shias are not really a community in this period. One can perhaps talk of proto-Shias and proto-Sunnis, but this episode will later become one of the founding myths of Shiism. And this is a very powerful myth. If you go to southern Iraq and you go to Karbala, Karbala is now a shrine city. The entire city is based around a complex of shrines commemorating and housing the bodies of Imam Hussein and his followers at Karbala. And you see from all walks of life, from all regions of the world, whether it be Latin Americans, Nigerians, Iranians, Kuwaitis, Afghans, Indians, Uzbeks, who also come together and circumambulate these shrines and bellow, Hayhat minna dhilla. This is something that reverberates through Islamic history, and you will see the consequences of this all throughout the course, but especially if you look at early modern history, when you look at the Safavids and the Ottomans, and really the cultural, as well as the religious, as well as the spiritual consequences of the struggle over the caliphate and the sacrifices that some of the people who are vying for this very sacred mantle to power are making. After Hussein, it's no longer possible to really engage in a direct confrontation with the caliphate for the lineage of Ali. And that lineage usually opts to engage in non-violent resistance. And they become what is referred to as imams, who you can kind of tell by taking a different title, they are articulating a different kind of authority. They know that they can't sit in the capital of the empire and command all of the military troops, the emirs and the generals and the viziers. So they have to articulate a spiritual mandate that allows them to survive, but they never really give up the claim to true successorship, Khilafah, to the Prophet. They only have to be careful what they say, because now they realize the consequences of rising up in rebellion, but also in a very violent world. They realize that there is nowhere in the Ummah that they can go where they can be really free of the spies and the agents of the Caliph. Nonetheless, there are followers who think that it is the lineage of the Prophet that should be given the authority in the Ummah. And there are constant rebellions. They are not really coordinated, and really it's an emotive and transfuse movement. There isn't one coherent and cohesive mission where there is a command structure of any kind. These are flashes of violence which really derive a lot of emotional zeal and inspiration from the example of Hussein at Karbala, and decide to challenge in almost a death wish the authority of the Caliph. Pretty much all of these are put down violently. Nonetheless, the idea of the family of the Prophet, the lineage of the Prophet, being involved in the Khilafah and being given back the mantle of leadership over the Ummah, this is something that is constantly seductive. It's always in the periphery, always threatening the caliphs in Baghdad. Eventually, the Umayyads do meet their end. For almost a century, they managed to hold power over this vast and capacious empire until in the eastern lands, Khorasan, and Khorasan roughly corresponds to eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, this region of the Middle East and Central Asia, where you find a lot of the old landed aristocracy and military aristocracy of Iran. These are usually coming from lower nobility or old dynastic Parthian communities that were essentially knights, what you and I would think of as militaristic feudal lords, who are converting to Islam slowly. And they're realizing, remember I said the barrier to entry is very low? The barrier to entry is very low. You can just say there is no God but the one God, and Mohammad is his messenger, and you are now part of, culturally and confessionally at least, part of the in-group. Nonetheless, you have to usually, in order to ingratiate yourself with the Umayyad center, somehow swear some kind of a fealty, clientage, mawali, to an Arab chieftain. Because the Umayyads are really trying to retain the old structure that conquered the empire. And what was the old structure? The old structure was all about the Arab Bedouin clans. And as their influence subsides, what happens is that a lot of these clients who were formerly just in a lower station to their Arab chieftains come to the fore. There has been a very interesting study of the Hashemite revolution, and the Hashemite revolution is a better word for the Abbasid revolution. It's really a multifaceted revolution all across the Arab empire that seeks to overthrow the Umayyads. All of these different movements and these different missionaries, they're really united in only one thing. They don't have a united vision for what will come after the Umayyads. They only have this unification in terms of the Umayyads are not worthy of the Caliphate and they must be overthrown. And giving it Hashemite revolution, I think, better reflects this. There has been a great study by a historian in the American University of Beirut. It's kind of an old study, I think from the 1990s. Saeed Saleh Agha, and he went through meticulously the biographies of the main missionaries involved in the Hashemite revolution. What he realized is eye-opening. Over 80% of the leading missionaries in the Hashemite revolution were non-Arabs. These are overwhelmingly Ajam or Persian, people who had converted maybe themselves or maybe their fathers just a generation or two ago and had become the new elites in the periphery, in Khorasan, in the eastern Islamic lands, and were now calling for the overthrow of the Umayyads. One can kind of guess that these people who do not themselves come from any kind of Arab Bedouin clan or lineage, come from usually Persian, landed aristocratic backgrounds, are not very happy with the Umayyad system. The Umayyad system that is trying to retain the old Bedouin clan structure of the Arabs from Arabia. And they're pushing towards change. They don't exactly understand what change. And one of the missionaries, a man who takes the name Abu Muslim, we don't know really his original Persian name. We have guesses, but he takes the name Abu Muslim, father of the Muslim. And here you have a remarkably charismatic, but also ambiguous man, a man for all seasons, who puts together a very eclectic bunch of warriors. Sure, there are the new converts, many of them, like himself, from Persian backgrounds. There are many who are not Muslims at all, but have millenarian expectations. I think in the tutorials you talked about there are Zoroastrians, sure, but there are also Manichaeans and Mazdakites and people who have nativist religions in these eastern parts of the former Sasanian Empire, now the Islamic East. And he puts together a very large coalition of disaffected people. And the only thing that unites these different factions in the army, the Umayyads must go. Beyond that, confessionally, ideologically, they make for very strange bedfellows. But his knack, his genius, if you will, is going up to the Zoroastrian and Manichaean factions in the army and saying, look, you and I know that it is the end of the world as foretold in the Avesta. This is when the forces of Hormazd will triumph over that of the dark god Ahriman. But you and I should be intelligent enough to know that if we speak about this too loudly in the camp, then we'll piss off the Muslim factions, as well as the Buddhist factions, as well as everyone else. And then the coalition will collapse. So what you and I have to do is we have to be subtle about it. We have to keep a low profile and make sure we don't make this army disintegrate. Then he went to the Muslim factions and he said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank God we're finally overthrowing the Umayyads and we're restoring the caliphate to its original owners, the family of the Prophet. But all of these Zoroastrians and all of these Manichaeans, we need their numbers. We need as many people in order to guarantee we will be victorious, because this is a very important matter. We cannot let the family of the Prophet down. This is God's army, even though it might contain infidels. But you and I have to be intelligent enough to not declare La ilaha illallah too loudly, to not become, angry, to not be provoked whenever you see a Zoroastrian praying in the way that he does and blaspheming and doing idolatry. You and I have to be subtle, abide our time, and keep a low profile. So he's pretty much everyone's in man. Everyone looks at Abu Muslim and says, he's our guy. I mean, he can't say he's our guy, obviously, but he is definitely on our side. And with this mentality and this approach, he manages to march a very successful campaign all the way to the heart of Baghdad and overthrow the Umayyads. Of course, the Abbasid family, who he brings to power, are just as cunning as he is. And eventually they decouple him from the army and they have him assassinated. And there you have the establishment of a people, the Abbasids, who come from the lineage of the Prophet's clan. They do not descend from the Prophet, but nonetheless, they do descend from his uncle and are related to the family of the Prophet. And they ensconce themselves at the heart of this Arab empire, Arab in quotation marks, because even though the rulers are Arab, the people around the ruler overwhelmingly are non-Arab at this point. Already you're beginning to see the incorporation of non-Arabs and non-Bedouins of all varieties and backgrounds into the heart of this Muslim community, this ummah. There is, however, a big problem. The Abbasids are also a dynastic imperial entity, and they're ruling over an empire. How do you legitimate this? How do you legitimate this profoundly un-Islamic way of authority? Because imperial authority is not really regarded that highly in the early Muslim polity. In fact, in the Quran and in the Hadith, the more reliable ones, you see again and again the way that emperors and pharaohs appear in these kind of teachings is as negative characters. They are the evil entities which the prophets have to overcome. Especially the last one is quite instructive. The most awful title in Allah's sight on the day of resurrection will be that of a man calling himself Malik al-Amlak, King of Kings. But what you realize as an Abbasid Caliph is, that's me. I need something in terms of ideology and legitimacy that justifies this kind of imperial authority that I'm wielding. It's very all good for Mohammad to say this, because the community that he rules over is what? It's largely composed of Bedouins. It is largely non-sedentary, non-urban, non-hierarchical. How do structures of power work in Muhammad's community during his own time? There aren't any offices of state. There are certainly no hereditary offices of state. If something needs doing, if a dam needs to be built, the Prophet Muhammad will hold counsel amongst his advisors and he will choose someone himself and say, you're responsible for building this dam and these are the resources and you will have help. Let me know how it's going in 2 weeks. If an expedition needs to be led, he will say, Omar did a good job of that. I will give this task to Omar and you will take these 3 lieutenants as well with you. Make sure you get the expedition done and report back to me. So everything is ad hoc. No one has any particular position outside of being just Muslim. There is just one person with a title, and that's Muhammad, the leader of this ummah. This is just fundamentally different from what the Abbasids have to deal with. For them, they are dealing with a huge empire that stretches from one continent to the next, with many, many dozens of millions of people from all sorts of backgrounds, and many of them, of course, the overwhelming majority, in fact, are from sedentary backgrounds. And who is actually ruling and administrating these lands? A whole cadre of inherited offices, people who come from Parthian nobility and they say, well, I have a right to rule over these peasants here and I will send tribute and homage to Baghdad, but the Caliph has absolutely no right to come here and take away this hereditary office of nobility that I have. There is a very elaborate and complex and all-encompassing hierarchy of nobility, of hereditary rights and privileges. So the Abbasids have to contend with this, and this kind of ideology is completely out of sync with the realities that they're dealing with. It's perfectly suited for Muhammad. It is very much ill-suited for a caliph sitting in 7th or 8th century Baghdad. So what do? Do they just admit, well, look, being an emperor in our religion is just a terrible thing, therefore I'm going to give up power. I don't think this thing should be even in existence. An empire is antithetical to my sincerely held religious beliefs. Has anyone ever in the history of mankind said such a thing? No. And the Abbasid caliphs are human. They love power. They can't get enough of it. The only thing that they think about power is how can I preserve power? How can I have more of this power? Therefore, they look for an ideological structure, an edifice, which can justify, legitimate, and underpin their new realities, their new claims to power. And therefore, they go to pre-Islamic Iran. And in pre-Islamic Iran, you have a very elaborate and sophisticated discourse of imperial power, which is all about hierarchy, hereditary nobilities, and how they connect and relate to the imperial center. And also they find some legacies and models outlined by Sasanian emperors that are remarkably useful for an imperial head of state that has a very strong sense of sacral authority, of religion and state as being two sides of the same coin. This is not an Islamic rock relief. This is in fact a rock relief of Ardashir I, the founder of the Sasanian dynasty and the first emperor of Iran. And what is striking here, in terms of just forget about the context, just look at it visually. Yes?
The symmetry.
The symmetry. Because right opposite Ardashir is the major god, the great god of light. It's Ahura Mazda. And quite unsubtly, he is handing over the imperial diadem, signifying he is appointing Ardashir to have imperial authority on earth, just as he holds sacral authority in the heavens. And the person behind Ardashir is Shapur, his son and successor. The handing over of imperial authority is not just to one king of kings, it is to a whole lineage of king of kings. It is a dynastic kind of epigraph that you're looking at. And just as Ardashir has triumphed over the Parthian emperor and has essentially taken over his empire and established his new empire, you see the trampling of the god of darkness underneath the hooves of the horse ridden by Ahura Mazda. So the triumph of the sacral element against the dark element is just a reflection, a mirror image of the triumph of the Sasanians over their enemies. To obey the Shahanshah, Ardashir, is a mirror image and the equivalent of obeying Ahura Mazda. It is the same thing. To disobey him is to disobey God. It is to be caught in blasphemy. So with this kind of mandate, the Abbasid caliphs and even the Umayyads before them realized that there is a very useful repository of imperial ideas and imperial authority and discourses that we can reach into. And the perfect thing about this is all of these new Persian nobles, these recent converts who come from members of this overthrown hierarchy of nobility, are much more amenable to this framing of imperial authority. This is something that makes cultural sense to them. This is something that they can think our ancestors were ruled and ruled according to this structure. Now we can understand how the caliph can have authority in our dominion, and we can properly submit and have proper relations where he exists as the imperial figurehead and we exist under him under an elaborate hierarchy of nobility. And no one's going to take our position away. And we shouldn't take his position away either. So these are some quotes from various texts that are translated from Middle Persian to Arabic because the courts are hungry for this new ideological discourse and they want to tap into the old Zoroastrian texts of the Sasanians. But of course, they will no longer be Zoroastrian texts. All of these texts are translated into Arabic and all of them are Islamicized. Interspersed through the prose, you find quotes from the Abrahamic prophets. You find even Quranic verses. So it's the Islamicization of the pre-Islamic discourse on imperial authority. And that's why you have not just translation of Middle Persian texts like the Book of Deeds of Ardashir that becomes distinctly Islamicized. You also find really interesting texts like court manuals on how is it that I, as an imperial figure, should hold court. What is the correct protocol and what is the correct etiquette for a king of kings? When I appear to court, is it right that there should be a curtain separating me from the courtiers, lest they be looking directly and transgressing the boundaries by looking at a Shahanshah? All of these elaborate court ceremonies are taken from the old Sasanian model. And the interesting thing about these manuals, again, they're Islamicized, but you can clearly see who is receiving the emphasis as the model here. One or two short chapters about the sayings of the Prophet Mohammad, one or two short chapters about what the Rashidun Caliph might have said, but overwhelmingly, the lion's share is given over to what was said by Khosrow, what was said by Ardashir, what was said by legendary, historical, and mythical figures from Persianate imperial history. These are the people that they're overwhelmingly concerned through imitating. They want to be the incarnation of the Khosrow. And you can see, even in the location that they choose for their imperial capital, that there is kind of a synergy between the Abbasid present and the Sasanian past. Baghdad is within walking distance of Ctesiphon. It is very, very close. And Baghdad comes from the Persian root, Baghdad, God-given. So there is a very Persianate kind of element in the heart of this new imperial city. But this imperial city is a very interesting and very impressive place. Remember that vast empire? What you find is a pooling of resources and tribute and taxes from all the corners of this vast imperium into one central node, and that is Baghdad. And we sometimes think of the Islamic Golden Age, as it's called, as being really the Caliph, as the patron of arts and sciences and poetry and literature. That is not the case. He is one insignificant player amongst a whole cadre of elites who have a lot of money to spend and are throwing it all at the hands of poets, people who are astronomers, people who are theologians, and the Ulema. And we should talk about who the Ulema are. The Ulema, plural for alim or he who knows. This is a group of scholars that specializes in studying the Quran, interpreting the Quran in light of compilations of oral traditions or hadith. And they become an expert group of theologians over time. And certainly by the Abbasid period, this is a distinct social class of people. And they are part of the larger group of intellectuals that are receiving patronage. And in fact, if you are an astronomer, a mathematician, if you are writing on geometry and even anthropology like Ibn Sina does in the East, you also write quite a lot about Islamic theology. The way that science and intellectual endeavor in this period works is that you don't just do one thing. I think this is something that's kind of unfamiliar for us. We specialize in one discipline. You have very few people who specialize in several. That's the exception rather than the norm. I did my undergrad in maths, but after maths, I transitioned and I did my postgraduate work in history. Therefore, I'm a historian. I'm not a mathematician, and I don't do maths. You choose one discipline, and you become expert at it. For them, that makes absolutely no sense. If you want to be an alim, a knower, you have to be an expert in pretty much all the disciplines. You have to know the Quran inside and out. You have to know all of the major hadith books. You have to understand astronomy. You have to understand mathematics and geometry in order to do that. You also have to have a very good knowledge of medicine. You have to have read Aristotle, Hippocrates, and a whole host of Syriac texts. The ulama eventually become a challenge to the caliph, because something that exists in this period and really didn't exist in the earlier period, under the Rashiduns especially, is the need to pass judgment on issues of faith and theology. What is the correct way of performing the Hajj and all of this? It was always assumed that the caliph, surely, as the successor of the Prophet, he would be the authority. You would go to him and he would give you a satisfying answer. This is no longer the case. The ulema stake a claim to, no, we are the people who are the real successors of the Prophet. And lo and behold, they find plenty of hadith that points to them being designated as the Prophet's successors. The Prophet saying that my only true successors are the ulema. Ask them on matters of faith. And of course, this is a challenge to the authority of the caliph. If he's not the expert on all religious matters, if he isn't the point man on these issues, it fundamentally undermines some part of his authority. And sure, he's putting down roots in Persianate, pre-Islamic imperial identity, but that isn't in any way to imply that he's giving up all of his roots on the traditional Islamic Caliphal model of authority. He wants to have several legs to stand on. And he feels that one of his strongest legs is going to be knocked out from under him by these ulema and their weird claims about being the true successors of the Prophet, when he is the one who is called Khalifat al-Rasulullah. So what you see go on is, in the reign of Ma'mun, there is a tension between the caliph and the ulama on a matter that you and I would find very pedantic, kind of overly theological. Surely it's only a bunch of theologians sitting in some Baghdad coffee shop or library who would really care about this. But no, this is at the very heart of political discourse in this period. Because the Caliph al-Ma'mun makes an alliance, intellectual alliance, with this group of people called the Mu'tazilites. If I had a marker, which I do, well, not a good one. The Mu'tazilites were very much impressed by all of the Greek literature that they read. In particular, Aristotle. They loved Aristotle. And they thought that reason and rationality can be at the very heart of an Islamic theology. They translated, of course, a great many Greek texts into Arabic, and many people who did geometry and astronomy also drew on this. But for them, it was reason and rationality that could point the way to true faith. And for them, they started to debate the nature of the Quran as the word of God. What does it mean for it to be the word of God? Is it also eternal? Because if we take the word of God to be an attribute of God, surely it is eternal, very much like God himself. But that would mean that we have no free will, because they reasoned that if the Quran is in fact eternal, and it exists outside of time, then it contains all of this information about pharaohs, about people who were damned, about people who went astray, about people who made the right choice, which means all of this was predestined. God knew beforehand, before even time was created, that all of these people would exist and they would do as they are reported as doing. So the Quran is kind of a predestination schema for the universe and the moral trajectory of everyone, not just humanity, but everyone. So therefore, free will does not make sense. You are either predestined to be the pharaoh and make these mistakes and sin in the way that you are described, or perhaps if we want to retain free will, and the Mu'tazilites argued that we do indeed have free will, what is the solution? To say that clearly the Quran is created in time. It is not co-eternal with God. And for it to be the word of God, God must have preceded the words. So, no, the Quran is definitely created. The traditionalist school of scholars, which made up the overwhelming majority of the Ulema, rejected this as a kind of Greek-inspired innovation, bid'ah, and they said, no, the Quran is eternal, and we really ought not to think about these matters in any great detail. This is one of the mysteries. We have free will, but we ought not to reconcile it in this way, because using Greek logic on matters of faith and theology is inherently misleading. The Mu'tazilites are just applying logic and rational thinking to realms in which it makes no sense to do so. What the Caliph al-Ma'mun realizes is that he can use the Mu'tazilites and the createdness of the Quran as a pretext for persecuting the traditional ulema, who are increasingly undermining his notion of being the true authority in matters of faith. He wants to use it as a vessel through which he can weaken and therefore sideline the ulema and to claw back some of that lost religious legitimacy. He is ultimately unsuccessful. This is a very interesting episode in the early Islamic history of Muslims persecuting other Muslims according to an article of faith on doctrinal issues. It does not go well after Ma'mun. Mu'tasim, his successor, carries it on, and then the successor of him, Al-Mutawakkil, finally gives it up because he realizes it's not really going anywhere. It's only making the caliphate more and more unpopular and entrenching the ulema against his rule. So he finally gives it up, and I think since then, Mu'tazilites have kind of gone out of fashion in mainstream Sunni beliefs. Even though a lot of these kinds of beliefs, especially on the createdness of the Quran, this is something that is retained by mainstream Shi'i scholars. Nonetheless, this is part and parcel of the caliph losing power in general. It's not just the ulema who are undermining him, but a lot of these Eastern kind of hereditary nobles in Khorasan who come from these old aristocratic families of Persian and Parthian origin, they really don't think that these officials from Baghdad should be poking around their lands and asking peasants how much their yields are and asking peasants for annual tax contributions. What you find is greater and greater autonomy being granted to these Eastern nobles. And these Eastern nobles are eventually largely administered very loosely by a family of Persian origin that comes from Transoxiana called the Tahirids. They send tribute back to Baghdad, but it's tribute, it's not taxation. Baghdad doesn't have any tax agents or officials or administrators in these Eastern lands. They have to rely on the autonomous partners that they have in the Tahirids. But it's not just that. Now that the structure, the social structure and economic structure of the empire has changed, and changed so fundamentally, what you see is these Arab Bedouin chieftains and the Arab kind of base of the army has fundamentally changed. Overwhelmingly, now you have non-Arabs who are the rank and file, if you will, as well as the generals. The leadership are also predominantly non-Arab. You also find that there are different power centers that are trying to wrest power away from the caliph. The administration is stocked by Persian bureaucrats and Persian viziers, and they become a clique. And they intrigue against the caliph sometimes. They intrigue to have their own candidate, their own successor in the family put on the throne. And the generals who come from the east, they also realize not only do we have our own base, our own kind of landed aristocratic base in eastern Iran, but we can use that as a base from which to project power into Baghdad. So I'm going to send my son or my nephew down to Baghdad to represent my interests. And perhaps we can come together in a coalition and make sure the right candidate, the right Abbasid prince, is made into the next caliph. The Abbasid caliphs realized that they have to balance these constituencies against one another. How do you usually do that? I mean, you create a brand new constituency. The best way and easiest way, if you have a lot of money, like the Abbasids do, is you buy slaves and you create a slave corps army. This will be something that is repeated again and again and again in so many different Islamic dynasties, from the Safavids to the Ottomans to the Mughals. Pretty much everyone uses slaves. It's the classic way to deal with petty nobles and viziers who are struggling and really undermining your authority. You re-establish authority by introducing an outside force that is going to piss off all of these constituents. And these slaves, because they're coming from the outside into a new environment, what happens? They're very scared, and they ought to be scared, because they know these viziers and these old cadre generals, they're very much plotting against me. They want me gone. So it's me and the caliph. I have to rely on my master in order to survive. At least that's what it's like in the first generation. And then the second and third generation of this elite slave corps realize that they can make alliances with some viziers. They become entrenched in the local economy and local society. And what you have is the slave corps now becomes a threat in and of itself to the caliph. And in fact, it is the Turkic Mamluk slaves that really spell the doom of practical, de facto Abbasid rule. From there on, the Abbasids are largely figureheads. They are not de facto rulers. They are used as puppets for much more powerful slave generals, noble generals, other dynastic kind of entities, or viziers. And the further and further you get from this period, the more and more of a figurehead the Abbasid Caliph is. I will see you the day after tomorrow. Goodbye.